The story of Lex Luthor begins not with power, but with hunger. Hunger for recognition. Hunger for control. Hunger to rise above the shadows of ordinary men. Born in Metropolis, Lex didn't inherit kindness or compassion. What he inherited was pain, neglect, and an obsession with escaping weakness. Some stories say his parents died young. Others describe an abusive household where he was taught that love is a lie. But whichever version you read, the truth remains the same. Lex grew up believing power was the only thing that mattered, and he found that power early. By his teenage years, Lex was already building machines that baffled experts. By his 20s, he founded Lex Corp, a corporation so vast it swallowed entire industries. Lex wasn't just rich. He was untouchable. Metropolis hailed him as a savior. The genius who built skyscrapers that touched the heavens. The visionary who created technologies that could change lives. The man who promised to lead humanity into a brighter future. But underneath the applause, Lex felt only emptiness. It wasn't enough to be admired. It wasn't enough to be wealthy. He wanted to be remembered as humanity's greatest champion. And for a time, he might have succeeded. Until one man from the stars ruined everything. The day Superman appeared, Lex Luthor's destiny changed forever. One moment, he was humanity's brightest mind. The next, he was a shadow beneath a god in a cape. Think about it. All of Lex's brilliance, all his achievements, all his empire, and none of it mattered anymore. Because now the world looked up, literally, to someone else. An alien. A stranger. A man who could lift mountains and fly through the skies without effort. Metropolis no longer whispered Lex's name. They cried out another, Superman. For Lex, it was intolerable. His empire wasn't just threatened, his very identity was stolen. How could humanity revere a man who wasn't even human? How could they worship someone who never earned his power, never built it, never struggled for it, but was simply born with it? To Lex, Superman wasn't a savior. He was a fraud. A parasite. A crutch that would make humanity weak. And so began one of the greatest rivalries in comic book history. Lex poured every ounce of his genius into countering the Man of Steel. Wore suits that could match Superman punch for punch. Weapons forged with kryptonite. Endless schemes designed to prove, once and for all, that Superman was not a hero, but a threat. But it wasn't just science. Lex wielded politics, money, and influence with equal mastery. One day he was building machines to destroy Superman. The next, he was convincing the people of Metropolis to fear him. And sometimes, terrifyingly, Lex's words made sense. Because Superman was dangerous. Superman could destroy the world if he wanted. And in Lex's mind, that justified everything. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for the future of humanity. At least, that's the story Lex told himself. And so Lex Luthor rose. Not just as a billionaire genius. Not just as Superman's greatest enemy, but as one of the most dangerous men in the world. And this was only the beginning. Because Lex Luthor's hunger would take him further than money. Further than science. Even further than Metropolis itself. It would take him into the halls of power. Into the heart of politics. Into a position no one thought possible. The White House. Lex Luthor wasn't finished rising. He was only getting started. For most men, becoming a billionaire genius would be enough. For Lex Luthor, it was only the foundation. He didn't just want influence. He didn't just want admiration. He wanted authority. Unquestionable. Unshakable. Absolute. And somehow he got it. Through careful manipulation, charm, and sheer brilliance, Lex Luthor became president of the United States. Yes. The same man who dedicated his life to destroying Superman now stood as the leader of the free world. For a time, he played the role well. Lex spoke of unity, of progress, of protecting humanity from alien threats, and millions believed him. Because who better to defend humanity from gods and monsters than a man who built his empire from nothing? But behind the speeches, behind the patriotic promises, the old obsession remained. Every policy, every military project, every alliance, all of it was aimed at one goal, erasing Superman. And Lex nearly succeeded. There were moments when he turned the world against the Man of Steel. Moments when Superman doubted his place on Earth. Moments when Lex convinced governments, armies, even ordinary people that Superman was the danger, not the savior. And isn't that the terrifying part? Sometimes Lex was right. Superman was a risk. He was a weapon no one could control. And the thought of one alien holding such power was terrifying. But Lex's truth was poisoned by his pride. Because even if Superman never lifted a hand against humanity, Lex would still hate him. Not for what he might do, but for what he represented. A symbol brighter than Lex could ever be. And that pride drove him to ruin. The higher Lex climbed, the more reckless he became. He made alliances with monsters. He armed himself with kryptonite weapons. He gambled humanity's safety on his schemes. At times, his genius nearly toppled Superman. At times, he stood inches from victory. But each time, his downfall was the same. Lex couldn't see beyond himself. His obsession blinded him. His arrogance betrayed him. And when the truth of his corruption was exposed, his presidency collapsed. The savior became the tyrant. The visionary became the villain. The genius who promised to lead humanity into the future was left in chains. But here's what makes Lex Luthor unforgettable. Even at his lowest, even disgraced, even imprisoned, he never stops. Lex doesn't quit. Lex doesn't surrender. Defeat only sharpens his hunger. Because to him, the war against Superman isn't just about winning. It's about proving a point. It's about showing the world that men, ordinary men, can rise above gods. And in that belief, Lex is terrifying. Because he doesn't see himself as evil. He sees himself as necessary. In his mind, he's not a villain. He's the only man willing to do what must be done. The only man strong enough to stand against a god. The only man brave enough to keep humanity's destiny in human hands. But destiny is cruel. And pride has a cost. The more Lex fought to save humanity from Superman, the more humanity saw him for what he truly was, not a savior. Not a protector, but a man consumed by obsession. And that obsession would drag him down once more, because the war against Superman never ends. And in trying to defeat him, Lex Luthor sealed his own fate. Lex Luthor's greatest strength was his genius. His greatest weakness was his pride. And in the end, it was pride that destroyed him. Superman never truly needed to kill Lex. He never needed to break him with brute force. Because Lex always broke himself. Every scheme, every lie, every alliance with monsters darker than himself. They stacked higher and higher until his empire couldn't stand. And when it crumbled, the fall was brutal. The people who once adored him turned away. Metropolis, the city that once praised him as a visionary, now whispered his name with fear and disgust. He wasn't a savior anymore. He was a tyrant. Even his fellow villains saw it. They knew Lex's obsession was a cage he built for himself. Because while others sought money, power, or destruction, Lex only wanted one thing: to prove he was greater than Superman. But he never could. And yet, he never stopped trying. That's the tragedy of Lex Luthor. He could have been the greatest hero humanity ever knew. He had the mind to cure diseases, the brilliance to end poverty, the vision to lead Earth into the stars. He could have done all of it, but he didn't. Because every invention, every plan, every ounce of genius was wasted on one obsession: Superman. The alien he could never surpass. The man who made Lex feel small. The god who reminded him that no matter how high he climbed, someone else was always higher. In some worlds, Lex tries redemption. He fights alongside heroes. He even wears the Superman emblem on his chest. But even then, the question lingers: is Lex truly redeemed, or just waiting for his next chance to prove he's better? Because Lex doesn't just battle Superman. He battles the very idea of Superman. The idea that someone born with gifts can be greater than someone who earned everything. The idea that hope can be stronger than fear. The idea that humanity will always look to the skies for salvation instead of to itself. And Lex will never accept that. That's why he endures. Decade after decade, universe after universe, Lex Luthor remains. Not because he always wins, but because he always rises again. He is the shadow Superman can never escape. The rival who will never surrender. The tyrant who could have been a savior and chose not to be. So what is Lex's true legacy? It isn't LexCorp. It isn't his fleeting political power. It isn't even the countless times he nearly killed Superman. Lex Luthor's legacy is the question he forces us to ask. Do we need Superman? Or does Superman keep us from becoming something greater? The answer may never be certain. But one thing is, as long as Superman flies, Lex Luthor will rise to drag him down. And that eternal struggle is what makes him one of the greatest villains of all time. The rise and fall of Lex Luthor is also the rise and fall of humanity's darkest mirror.